I clutched my daughter's small hand as we walked up the marble steps of the Whitmore mansion. The imposing colonial structure loomed before us, its pristine white columns and manicured gardens screaming wealth and privilege. Everything I had never been born into, and everything my late husband David had tried to escape from. "Mama, why do we have to come here?" 7-year-old Aria whispered, her dark eyes wide with uncertainty. My little girl had been diagnosed with dyslexia the year before, but she was bright and perceptive in ways that often surprised adults. "It's about Daddy's will, sweetheart," I said softly, smoothing down Aria's unruly curls. "We just need to listen to what the lawyer has to say." The heavy oak door opened before we could knock. Margaret Whitmore, David's mother, stood in the doorway. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her cold blue eyes looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain. "You're late," Margaret said curtly, stepping aside to let us in. "Traffic was heavy," I replied, keeping my voice steady. I had learned long ago not to rise to Margaret's bait. The foyer was exactly as I remembered from the few times David had brought me here during our marriage. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns on the marble floor, and oil paintings of stern-faced Whitmore ancestors gazed down from gilded frames. It was beautiful and suffocating at the same time. Grandmother Margaret, Aria, broke away from my hand and ran toward the older woman with the innocent enthusiasm of a child who hadn't yet learned she wasn't welcome. Margaret stepped back as if Aria carried a contagious disease. "Don't touch the furniture with your sticky hands," she said sharply. "We just had everything cleaned." Aria's face fell and she retreated back to my side. I felt my heart clench with protective anger, but I forced myself to remain calm. For Aria's sake. We were led into the study where David's father, Harrison Whitmore, sat behind a massive mahogany desk. His weathered hands were folded over a stack of legal documents, and his expression was as unwelcoming as his wife's. "Mr. Peterson will be here shortly," Harrison announced without looking up. "Sit down and wait quietly." Aria and I took seats on the leather couch that probably cost more than I made in 6 months as a pediatric nurse at the county hospital. The silence stretched uncomfortably until footsteps echoed in the hallway. James Peterson, the family attorney, entered carrying a briefcase. He was a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes that seemed apologetic as he glanced between the Whitmores and me. "Thank you all for coming." He began settling into a chair across from us. "I know this is difficult, especially so soon after David's passing." My throat tightened at the mention of my husband. 6 months had passed since the car accident, but the grief still felt fresh. David had been my anchor in a world that often felt hostile, especially when dealing with his family. "Let's get this over with," Margaret said impatiently. "We have dinner reservations." Mr. Peterson opened his briefcase and withdrew several documents. "David's will is quite straightforward in most respects. However, there are some unexpected provisions." He cleared his throat and began reading. "Most of the estate, the family business, shares the vacation homes. The art collection went to Harrison and Margaret as expected. But then came the surprise. To my beloved daughter, Aria Whitmore Rodriguez, I leave the sum of $2.5 million to be held in trust until her 18th birthday. Additionally, I leave her my personal investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $800,000. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt as though the air had been sucked from my lungs. I had known David came from money, but I'd had no idea about the extent of his personal wealth. "That's impossible." Harrison sputtered, his face turning red. "David never mentioned any separate assets. I assure you it's all legitimate," Mr. Peterson replied calmly. David was quite careful about keeping his personal investments separate from the family holdings. He opened these accounts shortly after Aria's birth. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "What about the guardianship of the money? Maya is hardly qualified to manage such a sum. Actually, David appointed Maya as the primary trustee," Mr. Peterson said, glancing at me with something that might have been approval. "However, he did name both of you as backup trustees in case anything should happen to Maya." I felt dizzy. I had been struggling to pay for Aria's speech therapy, and special tutoring on my nurse's salary. And now my daughter was essentially a millionaire. "This is ridiculous," Margaret snapped. "David must have been influenced by circumstances. A woman of Maya's background couldn't possibly understand the responsibilities that come with managing that kind of wealth." The thinly veiled racism in Margaret's tone made my cheeks burn, but I kept my expression neutral. I had dealt with the Whitmores' prejudice throughout my marriage to David, who had been the first person in his family to marry outside their elite social circle. "The will is ironclad," Mr. Peterson assured them. David took great care to ensure it would be upheld in any legal challenge. As we left the mansion that afternoon, my mind raced with the implications. The money would change everything for Aria college tuition medical care opportunities I could never have provided on my own. But I could see the calculation in the Whitmores' eyes, the way they looked at Aria with sudden, predatory interest. Over the following weeks, the Whitmores' attitude toward Aria shifted dramatically. Suddenly, they were calling regularly, insisting on weekly visits, and showering my little girl with expensive gifts. "She needs to understand her heritage," Margaret declared during one of these visits, presenting Aria with a designer dress that cost more than my monthly car payment. The Whitmore name carries responsibilities. I watched nervously as Margaret knelt down to Aria's level, her voice taking on an artificially sweet tone that set my teeth on edge. "You know, darling, your father always wanted you to be proud of your family legacy. The Whitmores have been important people in this community for generations, but Mama says I should be proud of being Mexican too," Aria replied innocently. "She teaches me Spanish words and we make abuela's recipes." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret's smile became strained. "Of course, dear, but you're a Whitmore first. That's the important part of who you are." I felt a chill run down my spine. I recognized the beginning of a campaign to undermine my influence over my own daughter. The visits became more frequent and more intrusive. Harrison would question me about Aria's schooling, her medical care, her daily routine. They criticized everything from my modest apartment to my choice to work full-time instead of being a stay-at-home mother. A child of Aria's special needs requires constant attention, Margaret said pointedly during one visit. "It's unfortunate that Maya has to work so much. We worry that Aria isn't getting the support she needs." The comments grew more pointed over time. They questioned my ability to help with homework. "She's clearly struggling with reading, and you're not trained to handle learning disabilities." They criticized our neighborhood. "It's not safe for a child to play outside in that area." They even found fault with my parenting style. "You're too permissive. Children need structure and discipline." Most insidiously, they began to undermine me directly in front of Aria. "Oh, sweetheart, you don't need to listen to Mama about that," Margaret would say when I tried to set boundaries. "Grandmama knows better," or Harrison would shake his head sadly when Aria mentioned something we'd done together. "Your mother means well, but she doesn't understand how important families like ours do things." I found myself constantly on the defensive, trying to maintain my authority as Aria's mother, while not wanting to create conflict that might hurt my daughter. I could see Aria becoming confused, torn between her love for me and the attention her wealthy grandparents were showering on her. The breaking point came during a school conference. I arrived to find both Harrison and Margaret already seated in the classroom, talking to Aria's teacher, as if they were the primary caregivers. "We're very concerned about Aria's progress," Margaret was saying to Mrs. Henderson. "Her mother works such long hours, and we don't think she's getting the academic support she needs at home. I wasn't aware that grandparents would be attending," Mrs. Henderson said, looking confused as I entered the room. "They invited themselves," I said tightly, taking a seat beside Margaret. The meeting was a disaster. The Whitmores questioned every aspect of Aria's education plan, suggested I wasn't capable of providing adequate help with homework, and even hinted that Aria might benefit from boarding school. "We just want what's best for her," Harrison said smoothly. "Sometimes loving a child means recognizing when professional help is needed." That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, filled with a growing sense of dread. I could see where this was heading, but I felt powerless to stop it. The knock came on a Thursday evening, while I was helping Aria with her reading homework. Through the peephole, I saw a man in an expensive suit holding an envelope. "Maya Rodriguez, you've been served." The papers inside made my blood run cold. Harrison and Margaret Whitmore were petitioning the court to be appointed as co-guardians of Aria's trust fund, claiming that I was financially irresponsible and lacks the sophistication necessary to manage complex investments. But that wasn't the worst part. Buried in the legal jargon was a request for supervised visitation, with claims that my work schedule and living situation were detrimental to the minor child's well-being and educational development. My hands shook as I read the detailed accusations. They claimed I was neglecting Aria's special educational needs, that our apartment was in an unsafe neighborhood, that my work schedule left Aria unsupervised too often. They had twisted every innocent comment, every normal aspect of our life into evidence of my inadequacy as a mother. The next few weeks were a blur of attorney consultations and mounting legal bills. I had to take time off work for court appearances, which only added to my financial stress. The Whitmores had hired one of the city's most expensive law firms, while I scraped together money for an overworked public defender. They have a strong case, my lawyer admitted during one of our meetings. They're not asking for custody, just financial guardianship and increased visitation. The court tends to be conservative about protecting large inheritances, but she's my daughter, I said desperately, and she'll remain your daughter. But if they can demonstrate that you're not equipped to handle a multi-million-dollar trust fund, I felt trapped. The very inheritance that was supposed to secure Aria's future was being used as a weapon against me. The preliminary hearing was a humiliation. The Whitmore's attorney painted me as a well-meaning but unsuitable guardian, someone whose limited education and financial background made me incapable of managing Aria's inheritance responsibly. "Mrs. Rodriguez works as a pediatric nurse," the lawyer said with subtle condescension. "While admirable, this hardly qualifies her to make complex investment decisions involving millions of dollars. They presented evidence of my modest income, my student loan debt, even the fact that I rented rather than owned my home. Everything about my working-class background was presented as evidence of my unsuitability. Worse, they brought in an educational consultant who testified that Aria's dyslexia required specialized attention that I couldn't provide, and the child would benefit from a more structured environment," the consultant said. "Perhaps with caregivers who have more time to dedicate to her special needs." My lawyer did his best, but he was outgunned. When the judge announced that the Whitmores would be granted temporary guardianship of the trust fund and increased visitation rights, I felt my world crumble. "This is a temporary arrangement," the judge emphasized. "We'll review the situation in 6 months," but I knew better. Once the Whitmores had legal control, it would be nearly impossible to get it back. The transition happened gradually then, all at once. The Whitmores used their new legal authority to slowly increase their control over Aria's life. First, it was longer visits, then overnight stays, then weekends. "The child needs stability," Margaret argued when I protested. "All this back and forth isn't healthy for her." My weekly visitations felt more like supervised meetings. I had to sit in the Whitmores' formal living room while Margaret watched every interaction, ready to criticize or interfere. "Don't let her sit on the silk cushions," Margaret would snap. "Aria, come away from there. You know better than to touch expensive things." I watched helplessly as my bright, curious daughter began to withdraw. Aria became quieter, more hesitant. She stopped asking questions and started looking to Margaret for approval before speaking. The final blow came 6 weeks later. I arrived for my scheduled visit to find Aria's belongings packed in boxes. "We've decided it would be best if Aria stayed with us full-time," Harrison announced without preamble. "Our attorney has filed the paperwork." "You can't do this," I said, my voice breaking. "She's my daughter. She's a Whitmore," Margaret replied coldly. "And she deserves to live in an environment that reflects that heritage." The legal maneuvering that followed was swift and brutal. The Whitmores' lawyers argued that my work schedule made consistent caregiving impossible, that Aria's educational needs weren't being met, and that the child's inheritance required full-time oversight. My new attorney, another overworked public defender, tried to fight, but the system seemed stacked against me. The Whitmores had connections money and a legal team that knew exactly how to navigate the system. When the judge granted temporary custody to the Whitmores, I felt something break inside me. I was allowed supervised visits once a week for 2 hours. The daughter I had raised alone for 7 years was suddenly living in a mansion where I was treated like a barely tolerated visitor. I knew Aria was suffering in that house, even though I could only see her for brief supervised visits. My once vibrant daughter had become quiet and subdued, always glancing at Margaret for permission, before speaking or moving. She had dark circles under her eyes and seemed to have lost weight. During our visits, I tried to maintain normalcy, but Margaret's constant presence made it impossible. Every hug lasted too long in Margaret's opinion. Every joke I made was inappropriate for a child of Aria's position. Every Spanish word I spoke earned a sharp rebuke. "We don't speak that language in this house," Margaret would say with disgust. "She's a Whitmore. Act accordingly." I could see my daughter disappearing before my eyes, becoming a shell of herself under their rigid control. But what could I do? I was a single mother with a nurse's salary going up against one of the wealthiest families in the state. Then came the Sunday that changed everything. I arrived for my weekly visit as usual, my heart heavy with the familiar dread of another supervised meeting in their sterile living room. Aria appeared at the top of the grand staircase, moving with the careful, measured steps she'd developed under the Whitmore's roof. But something was different today. There was a spark in her eyes that I hadn't seen in weeks. We went through the usual motions, sitting on the designated couch, while Margaret positioned herself like a guard dog in her wingback chair. The conversation was stilted and careful as always. "How was school this week, sweetheart?" I asked, using the neutral tone I'd learned was acceptable. "Fine, Mama," Aria replied automatically, but I caught something in her voice, a subtle urgency that made my pulse quicken. About an hour into the visit, as predictable as clockwork, Margaret stood up. "Excuse me for a moment," she announced, her heels clicking across the marble as she headed toward the powder room. The moment Margaret's footsteps faded, Aria sprang into action with an urgency that took my breath away. "Mama, listen to me very carefully," she whispered, grabbing my hands and pressing something small and familiar into them, her smartwatch, the birthday gift I'd given her the year before. "This has recordings on it, hours of them. They say terrible things about you and about me. They're stealing my money, and they want to make sure you never see me again." My heart hammered as I stared at the watch in my trembling hands. "Aria, what are you—" "There's no time to explain everything." My 7-year-old daughter interrupted, speaking faster than I'd ever heard her speak. "Go to the voice recordings. Listen to all of them. They prove everything they did to get me away from you. They call you names and say Daddy was stupid to marry you, and they want to send me to boarding school so they don't have to deal with me anymore." The maturity in my little girl's voice broke my heart. She had been forced to grow up too fast to become strategic and careful in ways no child should have to learn. "They use my trust fund money for themselves," she continued in a rush. "They bought a new car and said it was for me, but I never go anywhere. They pay fake bills for my tutoring that cost way more than it should. And Mama," her voice broke slightly, "they want to terminate your rights. They think you'll never be able to fight them because you don't have enough money for lawyers." The sound of heels on marble warned us of Margaret's return. I quickly slipped the watch into my purse, my hands shaking with a mixture of fury and hope. "I love you, baby girl," I whispered fiercely. "I'm going to fix this, I promise." "I love you too, Mama. I want to come home." Margaret reappeared in the doorway, her cold gaze immediately suspicious. "What are you two whispering about? I was just telling Mama about my piano lessons," Aria said with practiced innocence that made my chest ache. Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she couldn't prove anything wrong had happened. The rest of the visit passed in excruciating normalcy, but I felt lighter than I had in weeks. My daughter, my brilliant, brave daughter, had just handed me the key to bringing down the people who had stolen her from me. That night, I sat in my modest apartment and listened to hours of recordings that made my blood run cold, then burn with righteous anger. What I heard was worse than anything I could have imagined. Margaret's voice dripping with racist venom. I can't believe we're stuck with this burden. The child is clearly damaged all that Mexican blood. And then even more chilling, at least David had the good sense to die before he could produce any more mongrel children with that woman. Harrison's casual cruelty. The mother is getting suspicious about the tutoring bills. She asked why they cost twice what her research showed they should. Why waste money on remedial help for a child who's clearly never going to amount to anything she can barely read her own name? But the most damaging recordings were their discussions about the legal case itself. They had knowingly presented false information to the court, bribed witnesses, and planned to completely eliminate my parental rights. The educational consultant was expensive but worth it. Harrison's voice crackled through the tiny speaker. He'll say whatever we need him to say about the child's needs. And the social worker, Margaret asked. She understands that a generous donation to her department's fundraiser depends on her cooperation. I worked through the night transcribing the most damaging quotes and organizing the recordings by date and topic. By dawn, I had a comprehensive file that exposed not just the Whitmore's treatment of Aria, but their systematic corruption of the court system. My first call was to James Peterson, the family attorney who had read David's will. I'd always sensed he disapproved of how the Whitmores had treated me, and I prayed he would help. Mrs. Rodriguez, Peterson said when his secretary put me through. I heard about the custody situation. I'm sorry things have worked out this way. Mr. Peterson, I have evidence that the Whitmores committed fraud to gain control of Aria's trust fund and custody. I said without preamble. I need your help. There was a long pause. What kind of evidence? I explained about the recordings, playing a few of the most damning clips over the phone. Peterson's sharp intake of breath told me everything I needed to know. This is extraordinary, he said finally. How did you obtain these recordings? My daughter made them. She's been living in that house for weeks, listening to them plan her future like she doesn't matter. She's 7 years old, and she's been braver than any adult in this situation. Mrs. Rodriguez, I need you to bring everything to my office immediately. Don't make copies, don't share this with anyone else yet. If we're going to use this evidence, we need to do it properly. Peterson's office building was in the wealthy part of town, all glass and steel, and expensive cars in the parking lot. I felt out of place in my nurse's scrubs. I'd come directly from my shift, but I held my head high. I wasn't the same overwhelmed woman who had lost custody 6 weeks ago. I was a mother fighting for my child, and I had weapons now. Peterson listened to hours of recordings with growing amazement and disgust. His face grew harder with each revelation of the Whitmore's corruption and cruelty. This is enough to not only restore your custody, but to have them arrested for fraud, he said finally. The embezzlement from the trust fund alone could result in serious prison time. I don't care about revenge, I said firmly. I just want my daughter back. You'll have her back, Peterson assured me. But Mrs. Rodriguez, we can't let this slide. What they've done goes beyond your family. They've corrupted court officials, bribed witnesses, and stolen from a child. If we don't pursue charges, they'll do this to someone else. I thought about Aria's scared little face, the way my daughter had learned to shrink into herself under the Whitmores' roof. I thought about other mothers who might not have the evidence I'd been given. Do whatever you think is right, I said. I trust you. Peterson smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd ever seen from him. Your husband would be proud of you, Mrs. Rodriguez. And he'd be proud of Aria, too. That little girl showed more courage than most adults ever will. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. Peterson worked around the clock to prepare our case while I took leave from work to help organize the evidence. I barely slept, running on adrenaline and determination. The Whitmores had no idea what was coming. The courthouse was packed on Friday morning. I sat beside Peterson at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded tightly in my lap to stop their trembling. Across the aisle, the Whitmores sat with their expensive legal team, looking confident and slightly annoyed at having to deal with what they clearly considered a nuisance hearing. Margaret wore a designer suit and pearls the picture of respectable wealth. Harrison looked distinguished in his tailored jacket, every inch the successful businessman. They whispered to their attorney with the casual arrogance of people who had never faced real consequences for their actions. Judge Caroline Martinez called the court to order. I had researched the judge and learned she was known for being tough, but fair with a particular concern for children's welfare. Peterson had been pleased with the assignment. Your Honor. Peterson began when called upon. We're here today because my client's 7-year-old daughter has been living in an abusive situation for the past 6 weeks, and the people responsible obtained custody through fraud and perjury. The Whitmores' attorney, a sharp-faced man named Collins, started to object, but Peterson held up his hand. I have extensive audio evidence to support these claims recorded by the child herself. While living in the defendant's home, Judge Martinez leaned forward with interest. Audio evidence recorded by a 7-year-old. Yes, Your Honor. Aria Rodriguez Whitmore used her smartwatch to document the treatment she received and the conversations she overheard regarding her trust fund and her mother's parental rights. Peterson played the first recording. Margaret's voice filled the courtroom, dripping with disdain. I can't believe we're stuck with this burden. The child is clearly damaged, all that Mexican blood. I watched the judge's expression harden. Behind me, I could hear gasps from the courtroom gallery. The recording continued with Harrison's voice. At least the mother won't be around to influence her much longer. Collins jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is clearly inadmissible. The recording was made without my client's knowledge or consent. In their own home, Judge Martinez replied coldly, where they were speaking about a child in their temporary custody. The child had every right to document her treatment. Continue, Mr. Peterson. What followed was 2 hours of the most damning evidence I had ever heard presented in a courtroom. Peterson played recording after recording, each one more shocking than the last. Margaret calling me a minimum-wage gold digger, and discussing plans to terminate my parental rights. Harrison detailing how they were using Aria's trust fund money for personal expenses, and discussing investment schemes using her inheritance. Both grandparents mocking Aria's learning disability and referring to her as more work than she's worth. Most shocking of all, their recorded discussions about bribing court officials and paying witnesses to testify against me. The educational consultant was expensive but worth it. Harrison's voice played clearly through the courtroom speakers. He'll say whatever we need him to say about the child's needs. Collins looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The Whitmores sat frozen, their faces pale with shock and growing panic. But Peterson wasn't finished. He presented financial records showing exactly how the Whitmores had been stealing from Aria's trust fund. Receipts for personal purchases charged to my daughter's account. Investment documents showing Aria's money being funneled into Harrison's failing business ventures. Your Honor, Peterson said as he concluded his presentation. These people didn't seek custody of Aria out of love or concern for her welfare. They saw a $3 million trust fund and decided to help themselves. They've emotionally abused this child, stolen her inheritance, and corrupted the legal process to do it. Judge Martinez's face was thunderous. She turned to Collins. Does your client have any response to these accusations? Collins whispered frantically with the Whitmores for several minutes before standing. Your Honor, we request a recess to prepare our response. Denied. Your clients have had 6 weeks to prepare for the consequences of their actions. They chose to spend that time stealing from a child instead. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. Custody of Aria was immediately returned to me. The Whitmores were stripped of all guardianship rights, including control of the trust fund. An independent financial manager would be appointed to oversee Aria's inheritance until she reached adulthood. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. The evidence presented today shows clear violations of fiduciary duty, child abuse fraud, and corruption of the legal process. She looked directly at Margaret and Harrison, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. You two have disgraced not only yourselves but the memory of your son. You took a grieving child and treated her like a commodity to be exploited. You stole from her, abused her, and attempted to permanently separate her from her loving mother. Margaret was openly weeping now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of a woman who had finally been caught and held accountable. Mrs. Rodriguez, Miss. The judge continued, turning to me with a much gentler tone. You will have full custody of your daughter within the hour. I'm also ordering the Whitmores to pay your legal fees and to undergo a full forensic audit of how they've handled your daughter's trust fund. As the gavel came down, I felt 6 weeks of fear and helplessness lift from my shoulders. I was getting my daughter back. Aria was in the music room when the police arrived at the Whitmore mansion. Later, she told me she could hear raised voices from downstairs, Margaret shrieking about that ungrateful Mexican woman, and Harrison demanding to speak to his attorney. But Aria just sat quietly at the piano bench, waiting. She knew I was coming for her. She had done what needed to be done, and now everything would be different. When the social worker appeared in the doorway with a kind smile, Aria was ready. Hello, Aria. I'm Mrs. Chen from Child Services. Your mother is here to take you home. My daughter slid off the piano bench and walked calmly to her packed suitcase. She had been ready for this moment for weeks. I was waiting in the foyer, my face streaked with tears of joy and relief. The moment Aria appeared at the top of the stairs, we both started running. Mama, Aria flew into my arms, finally safe to be loud and emotional and completely herself. Mi niña valiente. I whispered, holding my daughter tight. My brave girl, I'm so sorry you had to go through this. It's okay, Mama. I knew you'd figure out a way to save me. Behind us, Margaret continued her hysterics, while Harrison tried unsuccessfully to maintain his dignity as the police placed him in handcuffs. Their world of privilege and corruption was crumbling around them, but Aria and I barely noticed. We were too busy holding each other and planning our future. Can we go home now? Aria asked. Our real home? Yes, baby, we're going home. 2 years have passed since that day in court, and our lives have transformed in ways I could never have imagined. The small house I bought with a portion of Aria's trust fund isn't anything like the Whitmore mansion. It has 3 bedrooms, a tiny yard, and neighbors who actually smile and wave. I chose it specifically because it felt warm and welcoming, everything the mansion had not been. Aria has thrived in our new environment. With proper support for her dyslexia and the freedom to be herself, she has blossomed into the confident, curious child she had always been meant to be. Her reading has improved dramatically, and she discovered a talent for creative writing that amazes her teachers. I returned to nursing, but now I work at a private clinic with better hours and benefits. The financial security of Aria's trust fund, now properly managed by an independent firm, means I can focus on being present for my daughter, instead of constantly worrying about money. The Whitmores both pled guilty to multiple charges rather than face a public trial. Harrison received 2 years in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud. Margaret got 18 months and community service. They were also ordered to pay substantial restitution and court costs. More importantly, they were permanently barred from any contact with Aria. Mama, can you help me with my story? Aria called from her bedroom one Saturday morning. I found my daughter at her desk, surrounded by papers and colored pencils, working on what appeared to be a short novel. What's it about, Mija? It's about a little girl who saves herself and her mom from bad people by being smart and brave. Aria explained matter-of-factly. I'm calling it The Recording Princess. I smiled and kissed the top of Aria's head. That sounds like a very good story, sweetheart. It has a happy ending, Aria added, then paused thoughtfully. Do you think Daddy would be proud of me for being brave? My throat tightened with emotion. I think he would be the proudest father in the world. You saved our family, Aria. You showed more courage than most adults ever will. Aria beamed and returned to her writing. As I watched my daughter work, I reflected on how much our lives had changed. The trauma of those 6 weeks would always be part of our story, but it wasn't the ending. We had written our own ending, one filled with love, justice, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and daughter. Outside, the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of our modest home, warming everything it touched. It was nothing like the cold marble and crystal of the mansion, but it was ours. It was home, And for Aria and me, that was worth more than all the Whitmore money in the world.